Inside Angola Prison, the hidden world of Louisiana's death row. In the deep heart of Louisiana, surrounded by swamps, farmland, and barbed wire, stands one of the most feared prisons in America, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known by a single name, Angola. Built on what was once an 18,000-acre slave plantation, Angola is more than just a prison. It's a living monument to America's most complex history: slavery, punishment, and survival. Inside its gates, over 5,000 men serve sentences that will likely never end. Some are working the same fields their enslaved ancestors once did, now in state-issued uniforms instead of chains. But there's one place inside Angola even the toughest inmates fear: death row, a concrete world where Louisiana's most condemned men await their final day. In this video, we're stepping inside that hidden world, where the air is heavy, time stands still, and every door locks from the outside. We'll uncover what life is really like for those living under a death sentence, from the routines, isolation, and legal battles to the haunting reality of execution day. No rumors, no myths, only verifiable facts from court records, state reports, and first-hand investigations. Because behind every death row number is a story, and behind every story is a system that rarely forgives.
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
The land and the legacy: how Angola became America's largest prison. Angola sits on 18,000 acres of land bordered by the Mississippi River. It's the largest maximum security prison in the United States, larger than the island of Manhattan's Central Park. But to understand Angola today, we have to go back to what it was before razor wire and gun towers: a slave plantation. From plantation to prison, the land was originally part of several plantations, including one named after the African country Angola, where many of the enslaved people were brought from. The soil was rich, perfect for cotton and sugarcane. Enslaved Africans worked the land in brutal conditions until the Civil War ended slavery in 1865. But freedom didn't last long. By the late 19th century, Louisiana, like many southern states, found a new system to continue forced labor: convict leasing. Under this system, prisoners, mostly black men, were leased to private companies and plantations to work under deadly conditions. Many were arrested under vague vagrancy or loitering laws designed to criminalize freed black men. The system was so brutal that a local newspaper once called it worse than slavery. In 1880, the state purchased the old plantation land and converted it into a prison. It became known as Angola Farm, and later simply Angola Prison. The farm prison model. Unlike the concrete complexes of modern prisons, Angola was structured like a working farm. Even today, inmates still work long hours under the sun, cultivating crops and raising livestock. Critics often point out the haunting parallels between slavery and the modern system. Rows of mostly black inmates working under armed white guards on horseback. Former inmates have described the work as mandatory. Refusal can lead to punishment or loss of privileges. The prison, however, maintains that labor teaches discipline and provides purpose. As of the 2020s, Angola remains the only self-sustaining prison in the U.S., producing much of its own food and running operations like a small city, with a hospital, fire department, and even a rodeo. The birth of death row Louisiana has practiced capital punishment since its early colonial days. Executions were once public events held in town square, but after the 1930s, executions moved behind prison walls. In 1957, Angola became the state's official site for executions. At first, death sentences were carried out in the electric chair, known as gruesome gurney. The chair traveled between parishes for local executions until it was permanently stationed at Angola. From 1957 to 1991, gruesome gurney executed 87 people, all within Angola's walls. Today, Louisiana's death sentences are carried out by lethal injection, inside a small, windowless room in the main prison complex. The modern death row at Angola is located in Camp F, a cluster of buildings separated from the general population. Roughly 60 to 70 men live there under constant supervision. Most have been convicted of first-degree murder. Some have been on death row for decades as appeals and legal battles drag on. Prisoners on death row live in isolation cells measuring roughly 6 by 9 feet. They are confined 23 hours a day, allowed 1 hour of recreation, usually alone in a fenced yard known as the dog pen. Human contact is extremely limited. Meals are passed through small slots in the door. Guards monitor every movement. The Louisiana Department of Corrections describes death row as a secure housing unit for inmates under sentence of death, emphasizing safety and control. But human rights observers and journalists have described it as one of the most psychologically punishing environments in the U.S. prison system. Life and work at Angola. Outside of death row, the prison functions like a massive industrial farm. Inmates plow fields, harvest crops, and maintain cattle herds. The prison's Angolite magazine, founded in the 1950s, once published photos showing inmates bent over in fields, guarded by men on horseback with rifles. In the 1970s, under Warden C. Paul Phelps, the prison began limited reforms. The Angolite, edited by inmate journalists Wilbert Rideau and Billy Sinclair, began documenting Angola's violent history from corruption to abuse. Rideau's reporting earned national recognition and even a George Polk Award. It was one of the first times America saw an unfiltered look inside a U.S. prison. But even with reforms, the legacy of violence and forced labor continued to shadow Angola's reputation. Notorious inmates and cases. Some of the most well-known inmates ever housed at Angola include members of the Angola Three, Albert Woodfox, Herman Wallace, and Robert King. They spent decades in solitary confinement after being convicted of the 1972 murder of a prison guard, a case that later drew global attention. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, called their isolation cruel, inhuman, and degrading. Woodfox was released in 2016 after 43 years in solitary confinement, one of the longest stretches in U.S. history. Angola's death row has also held men whose cases reached national attention, including Gerald Bourdillon, executed in 2010 after waiving his appeals, and Antoinette Frank, one of the few women on Louisiana's death row, housed separately at another facility. Conditions and oversight. In 2013, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and other advocacy groups filed lawsuits over Angola's medical care and heat exposure, arguing that conditions violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Court filings described cell temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with inadequate ventilation and medical care. In 2014, a federal judge ruled that Angola's medical system was deliberately indifferent to serious medical needs, citing systemic neglect. While the Louisiana Department of Corrections later reported substantial improvements, independent reviews and investigative journalists continue to describe chronic understaffing, outdated facilities, and extreme isolation on death row. Inside death row, life in a 6x9 world. When a man is sentenced to death in Louisiana, his journey doesn't end in a courtroom. It ends here, inside Camp F, the death row unit of Angola prison. From the outside, Camp F looks like a row of plain concrete buildings surrounded by high fences and guard towers. But inside, it's a world frozen in time, where every sound, every movement, and every breath is monitored. The cells. Each inmate lives alone in a 6x9-foot concrete cell, barely large enough for a bed, a sink, and a toilet. The walls are painted in pale institutional colors, often chipped and faded by time. There's a narrow slit of a window, but most inmates say it lets in little light. Cells are equipped with metal bunks and thin mattresses. In summer, the heat can be unbearable. Inmates have reported temperatures reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit during Louisiana's long, humid summers. A 2013 lawsuit by death row inmates described the unit as an oven made of concrete and steel, with no air conditioning and limited airflow. Guards pass meals through a small rectangular slot in the steel door, called the bean slot. Communication between prisoners is mostly through shouting across the hallways or fishing, sliding strings under the door to exchange notes or small items. Prisoners are allowed 1 hour of outdoor recreation per day, 5 days a week. Alone, in a fenced yard surrounded by wire. The rest of the day, 23 hours, is spent in isolation. The Louisiana Department of Corrections officially describes this confinement as necessary for safety, citing the high-risk nature of death-sentenced inmates. But mental health experts have repeatedly warned that such extreme isolation causes severe psychological damage, including anxiety, depression, paranoia, and hallucinations. A 2016 psychological assessment of Angola's death row found that over 70% of inmates exhibited symptoms of serious mental illness or post-traumatic stress due to prolonged isolation. The routine. Days on death row follow a strict routine. 5 a.m. Guards wake inmates for count. Every man must stand at his door as officers confirm their presence. 6 a.m. Breakfast trays are passed through the slot, usually grits, bread, and coffee. 7 a.m. to 12 p.m. Most inmates remain in their cells. Some read or write letters. Others simply stare at the walls. 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Recreation or showers on a rotating schedule. Only a few inmates are allowed out at a time. 4 p.m. Dinner, followed by another head count. 9 p.m. Lights dim. Silence takes over. Televisions and radios are not standard privileges. They must be earned through good behavior or purchased if allowed. Mail is monitored. Conversations with other inmates are limited to brief exchanges with those in nearby cells. According to former warden Burl Cain, who led Angola from 1995 to 2016, this structure was meant to maintain discipline and spiritual order. Cain introduced mandatory Bible studies and encouraged inmates to find faith as a form of rehabilitation, even for those condemned to die. Critics, however, saw it as forced evangelism, arguing that participation was sometimes tied to privileges like jobs or visits. The psychological toll. Psychiatrists who have studied Angola's death row describe it as one of the most extreme environments in the American penal system. Inmates spend years, sometimes decades, in solitary confinement, awaiting legal appeals that move slowly through Louisiana's courts. In 2014, an inmate named Christopher Sepulvado, sentenced to death for the 1992 killing of his stepson, had spent more than 2 decades on death row without an execution date. His lawyers argued that this prolonged uncertainty amounted to psychological torture. The courts disagreed, but human rights groups took notice. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture later cited Angola's death row in a 2015 report on prolonged solitary confinement, warning that it may violate international human rights standards. Even guards have acknowledged the toll it takes. One former corrections officer, speaking anonymously to the Advocate newspaper, said, "It's quiet in a way that gets inside your head. You start thinking about time, how long they've been there, how long you've been there. It wears on you the sound of silence." One of the most striking descriptions of Angola's death row comes from the Angolite, the inmate-run magazine. In a 1999 feature titled Voices from the Row, one prisoner described the silence as so loud you start hearing your own heartbeat. Some inmates cope by reading the Bible or writing letters to anyone who will listen. Others create artwork from whatever materials they can find: paper, pencil, even soap carvings. These drawings sometimes appear in prison newsletters or charity auctions. But many inmates spiral into despair. Between 1990 and 2020, at least 8 men on Louisiana's death row died by suicide or untreated illness before their sentences could be carried out. Legal limbo. Louisiana's death penalty system has been stalled for years. Although executions are legal, the state has not carried one out since 2010, largely due to shortages of lethal injection drugs and ongoing legal challenges. That means dozens of inmates live in a kind of legal limbo, sentenced to die but with no execution date in sight. As of 2024, 64 inmates remained on Louisiana's death row, according to state data. Some have been there since the 1980s. The state's longest-serving death row inmate, David Brown, has been under sentence of death since 1987, over 35 years. His case, like many others, has been delayed by appeals, retrials, and procedural reviews. This legal uncertainty creates what psychologists call death row syndrome, a condition marked by hopelessness, chronic stress, in deep emotional numbness. A 2020 report by the Death Penalty Information Center found that Louisiana has one of the highest reversal rates in the nation. More than 70% of death sentences are eventually overturned or reduced on appeal due to errors or misconduct. The role of faith and the chapel. Despite the darkness of life on death row, Angola's administration has long promoted religion as a source of hope and order. The Angola Prison Chapel, built in the 1980s and expanded under Warden Kane, hosts weekly worship services for all inmates, including those on death row. Ministers and volunteers, many from the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, conduct outreach programs inside Camp F. Some inmates even earn theological degrees through prison-based seminaries, becoming inmate ministers who lead prayer groups and funerals. One of the most well-known programs, the Moral Rehabilitation Initiative, is based on the belief that even those condemned can find redemption. Supporters praise it for reducing violence and promoting structure. Critics argue that it cannot replace systemic reform or fair legal representation. The view from the outside. Because Angola is located over 100 miles from New Orleans and surrounded by farmland, few outsiders ever see the death row unit firsthand. Access is tightly restricted. Reporters must obtain special clearance, and cameras are rarely allowed inside. Even families of inmates face long journeys and limited visitation rights. Visitation usually happens through glass, with phones on each side. No physical contact. Family members have described these visits as both a blessing and a punishment, a brief reminder of life beyond the walls, followed by the heartbreak of leaving again. In 2019, a mother of a death row inmate told the Times-Picayune, "You look at him and see your baby, but there's glass between you. You can't touch him. You just tell him to stay strong, even when you know it's killing him inside." Medical care and aging prisoners. With decades-long appeals, Angola's death row population has grown older. Today, over half of the men on death row are above the age of 50. Some are now too frail or ill to stand during headcount. Medical care has been a recurring controversy. In 2014, a federal court ruled that Angola's healthcare system was grossly deficient, citing broken equipment, understaffing, and delays in treatment. The prison agreed to reforms, but follow-up inspections showed continued gaps, especially for inmates in segregation like those on death row. Aging inmates often rely on other prisoners to pass along supplies or advocate for treatment. In one documented case, an inmate died from untreated liver disease after multiple requests for care went unanswered for months. The human element. Behind every name and number on death row is a story, and those stories vary widely. Some inmates maintain their innocence and continue fighting in court. Others admit guilt, but seek forgiveness or peace before their execution date ever comes. A few, like Gerald Bordelome, voluntarily waived appeals and asked for execution, saying they could no longer bear the waiting. In interviews with the Angolite, several inmates said they no longer fear death itself, only the slow crawl toward it. "It's not dying that scares me," one wrote. "It's waking up every day in a room that doesn't change, knowing the world forgot you exist." The execution chamber. Louisiana's lethal ritual. Few rooms in America carry the weight of history like the execution chamber at Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola. Hidden deep inside the main prison complex, behind a maze of gates and checkpoints, lies a small windowless chamber, a place designed for one purpose only: to end human life in the name of the state. The evolution of execution at Angola. When Louisiana centralized executions at Angola in 1957, it retired the era of traveling electric chairs. Before that, local sheriffs carried out death sentences using a mobile electric chair known as gruesome Gertie. The chair moved from parish to parish, powered by a generator truck, and was used to execute prisoners in courthouses and jails across the state. After a series of botched and controversial executions, the state built a permanent death house at Angola. Here, executions became a ritualized process, controlled, hidden, and heavily guarded. From 1957 to 1991, 87 men were electrocuted in Angola's death chamber. Witnesses described the room as small and sterile, with gray concrete walls, a glass window for observers, and Gertie positioned on a raised metal platform. The condemned were strapped in, electrodes attached to their legs and head, and a hood placed over their face. A jolt of up to 2,400 volts ended their life. In 1991, Louisiana retired the electric chair, joining other states in adopting lethal injection as its official method of execution. The old electric chair remains at Angola, now a museum artifact displayed during the annual prison rodeo. The lethal injection chamber. The new lethal injection chamber is located just a few steps from where gruesome Gertie once stood. It's a small, bright room with white walls, a gurney at the center, and a large observation window divided into 3 sections. One for media, one for victims' families, and one for officials. Adjacent to the chamber is the injection control room, where technicians and the warden oversee the procedure. Behind another wall sits the holding cell, where the condemned spends their final hours before execution. The lethal injection process typically uses a 3-drug protocol: sodium thiopental to induce unconsciousness, pancuronium bromide to paralyze the muscles, potassium chloride to stop the heart. However, since the mid-2000s, Louisiana, like many states, has faced shortages of execution drugs. Pharmaceutical companies began refusing to supply chemicals for use in executions, citing ethical concerns. As a result, Louisiana has been unable to conduct any executions since Gerald Bourdillon in 2010, the last person to die by lethal injection at Angola. The final 72 hours. For a condemned man, the final 3 days follow a precise schedule drawn from Department of Corrections protocol. Once an execution date is set by the governor, the inmate is transferred to the death house, a separate building adjacent to Camp F. There, he is placed under 24-hour watch. Guards monitor him constantly to prevent self-harm. During this time, he is allowed special visits from family, clergy, and legal counsel. Meals are offered on a normal schedule, but the last meal tradition remains. The inmate can request any food available from the prison kitchen within reasonable limits. Some ask for hamburgers or fried chicken. Others refuse food altogether. In the hours before the execution, the warden or chaplain visits to offer final prayers or conversation. A medical team prepares the intravenous lines, ensuring they're placed correctly. Though several states, including Louisiana, have faced scrutiny over execution mishaps involving collapsed veins or misplaced needles. At the scheduled hour, the inmate is escorted to the chamber. His wrists and ankles are secured to the gurney, IV lines are attached, and a microphone records the warden reading the official death warrant. When the warden asks if he has any final words, the inmate can speak freely. Some apologize to victims' families. Others maintain innocence. A few remain silent. Once the signal is given, the drugs begin to flow, and within minutes, it's over. The last words and witnesses. Executions at Angola are witnessed by a small group, usually 12 to 15 people, including the warden, the state's attorney general representative, media witnesses, and relatives of both the victim and the condemned. The most haunting part of any execution, many witnesses say, is the moment before the process begins, when the condemned looks toward the glass and sees the faces of those gathered to watch him die. According to media reports compiled by the Times-Picayune and Associated Press, here are some of the final statements recorded inside Angola's execution chamber. Gerald Bourdillon, 2010, the last person executed in Louisiana, said no final words. He waived all appeals and asked that his execution proceed without delay. Antoinette Frank, on death row since 1995, has never been executed, but her case remains one of Louisiana's most infamous. A former New Orleans police officer convicted of murdering fellow officers and civilians during a restaurant robbery. Dobie Gillis Williams, 1999, proclaimed innocence moments before his execution, saying, "I am innocent. I did not kill anyone. I leave now with love." Thomas Ward, 1995, convicted of murder, reportedly recited the Lord's Prayer as the drugs entered his veins. The execution process itself is largely silent. Only the soft hum of the IV machine and the warden's steady voice breaking the stillness. After the inmate is pronounced dead, witnesses are escorted out and the body is taken to the prison morgue for examination. Controversy and legal battles. Louisiana's death penalty system has faced decades of legal controversy. Civil rights groups, defense lawyers, and even former prosecutors have called it racially biased, geographically inconsistent, and deeply flawed. Studies by the Louisiana Law Review and the Death Penalty Information Center show that defendants accused of killing white victims are 7 times more likely to receive a death sentence than those accused of killing black victims. Furthermore, the majority of Louisiana's death row inmates come from just a few parishes, notably East Baton Rouge, Caddo, and Jefferson, reflecting what legal scholars call prosecutorial clustering. In 2014, then-Governor Bobby Jindal publicly defended the death penalty as a necessary tool of justice. But since 2016, successive governors, including John Bel Edwards, have expressed growing moral and practical opposition, citing the high cost, legal delays, and lack of available drugs. In 2023, Governor Edwards formally urged the state's Board of Pardons to consider clemency for all 56 death row inmates, arguing that it's time Louisiana moved past the death penalty. As of late 2024, the debate remains unresolved and no new executions have been scheduled. The staff and the warden. For those tasked with carrying out executions, the psychological burden is heavy. Former Angola warden Burl Kane often described his role as a spiritual duty. In interviews, he said he prayed with condemned inmates before their deaths, believing he was helping them find peace with God. But correctional staff have spoken anonymously of nightmares, guilt, and trauma after witnessing executions. Some requested transfers. Others left the department altogether. One former guard told The Advocate in 2016, "It's not just one man dying in that room. Everyone in there carries a piece of it out with them, the death chamber today." The lethal injection chamber at Angola remains operational but unused. Its stainless steel table, medical equipment, and observation windows are maintained for inspections, but have not been used since 2010. During public tours or special programs, officials occasionally show the chamber to journalists or visitors, emphasizing its historical role. The sight of the gurney and IV setup is a sobering reminder that while the machinery of execution may be idle, it has not been dismantled. As of 2025, Louisiana's death penalty is still law, but the machinery that enforces it stands silent, a relic caught between history and morality. Reflections from the inside. Many Angola inmates, and even those not on death row, speak of the execution chamber as a symbol of finality. When the lights turn on in that building, everyone inside knows what it means. One former prisoner, interviewed for the Angolite in 2018, said, "You don't have to see it to feel it. When they're preparing for an execution, the whole place changes. The guards go quiet. The air gets heavy for others. The chamber is a reminder of redemption." Several of Angola's inmate ministers, many trained through the seminary program, accompany condemned men during their final moments, offering prayer and comfort. Chaplain Jim O'Neill, who has served at Angola for over 20 years, told reporters, "Some of them go out crying, some go out singing, some just stare at the ceiling, but no one goes out alone." Angola's story reminds us, justice and suffering often walk the same road. If you learned something new today, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story from inside America's most notorious prisons. This is the Unspoken Stories, where we bring you the truth, one cell block at a time.